Good afternoon, everybody. Can you believe we're on Sunday afternoon? It's been such a great weekend, and I hope you've all had as much fun with it as we have. It's been a great whirlwind for all of us, and thank you so much for staying with us from Thursday till now. You know, we continue to thank you. You've heard this at every presentation, but the very special people, our sponsors, Bob Faircloth, Georgia Power, David and Nancy Cintron, Philip E. and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation. They're our presenting sponsors for this year, and they've been a terrific help to us. We thank you very much. And by now you know my name is Bo Anders, and I'm the president of the Book Festival. And I also want to thank the more than 250 volunteers we've had. You've seen them all weekend. They've been terrific, and they help make this festival a reality every year. So I'm overjoyed you're here for the afternoon for the authors of the 2019 edition of Joy of Cooking, John Becker and Megan Scott. I think you'll enjoy them. I've just spent 15 minutes talking cooking in the back. We're also fortunate today to have some special volunteers, book lovers just like you. They're serving as your ushers. Please join me in welcoming the members of the best little book club in town, Southside Coffee Bluff, Isle of Hope, and the Landings Bookies, and the Food for Thought Book Club. And of course, thank you again. They're not here now, but there's 23 authors that went out to the SBF in schools and talked to the children in this community about their writing experience and process. They were just terrific. And we also have a grant this year, as I've mentioned a couple of times, from Savannah's Cultural and Arts Investment Program, which help us make and will help us make SBF in schools even more enriching for our students. As an aside, though, I have to tell you, I don't know how, I know many of you saw John McMahon, the writer of The Good Detective, yesterday. He had a terrific presentation over at the Baptist Church. I went up to him afterward. I had taken him out to the SBF in schools, and we had a terrific time. We went to Garrison School for the Performing Arts, and the kids were absolutely fantastic. And I said to him, had you ever been to the LA Book Festival? Los Angeles Book Festival, which we went to last year, Chris and I. He said, yes. He says, very large. I said, well, what do you think about it? He said, your book festival is so much better than that book festival. Made us feel pretty good. Okay, you know the rules. Please turn off your cell phones. No flash photography. And questions at the end. We'll have a Q&A session with John and Megan. Questions at the end, one question, and no stories. Now, I'm gonna introduce Ariel Felton. She is an essayist and journalist living here in Savannah. Her work has been published in the Washington Post, the Progressive, the Bitter Southerner, and more. You've seen her in the Savannah Morning News. She's written a number of interviews with the authors that were here this week. She also once ran a blog called Books and Batter, where she decorates cupcakes inspired by her favorite books. So please welcome Ariel Felton to the stage.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us for the closing address of the 2020 Savannah Book Festival. Has it not been an awesome 4 days so far? Wow. I am honored to introduce this afternoon's guests, two folks who know both a good book and a good meal when they see it. First is author John Becker, who is the great-grandson of cookbook author Irma Rombauer. Irma's book, The Famous Joy of Cooking, included more than 500 tested recipes and has been in print continuously since 1936, selling more than 18 million copies. Each generation of the Rombauer family has contributed to periodic revisions of the book, updating and adding recipes, starting with Irma's daughter, Marion, then her son, Ethan, and now with Ethan's son, John. John grew up learning to appreciate a range of cooking styles, influenced by his father's spontaneous style and his mother's love of international foods and spices. John has an insatiable curiosity when it comes to food and to cooking. After earning an English degree, he helped publish 17 collections of literary essays before dedicating himself to the family business and updating Joy of Cooking for a new generation. Our next guest is Megan Scott, who started working for Joy of Cooking in 2010 when she and John Becker met and immediately bonded over a shared love of blue cheese. Sometimes that's all it takes. Megan's culinary education began in North Carolina, where she learned to cook from a long line of matriarchs. She grew up in a farming family, shucking corn and snapping peas as far back as she can remember. She has been a cheesemaker's apprentice, which, by the way, is my new dream job. She's been a baker, an assistant pastry chef, and in addition to her work for Joy, she is the culinary director for a marketing agency that specializes in food. In the newest edition of Joy of Cooking, John and Megan developed more than 600 new recipes. They tested and tweaked thousands of classics and updated every section of every chapter to reflect the latest ingredients and techniques available to today's home cooks. The revision strategy was much the same used by Irma and Marion years ago. They vet, research, and improve Joy's coverage of legacy recipes while introducing new dishes, modern cooking techniques, and comprehensive information on ingredients from both farmers markets and grocery stores. Whether it's the only cookbook on your shelf or one of many, Joy is and has been the essential and trusted guide for home cooks for almost a century. This new edition continues that legacy. Please join me in welcoming John Becker and Megan Scott.
Good afternoon. Hello, can you hear me? Good afternoon. Thanks for coming to our talk. There's so many people here. But it's really nice to be in a room with so many people who like to read and who value books. We're thrilled to be here. And you know, it was kind of funny when we were first invited to participate in the Savannah Book Festival. We were really honored and excited to come. And then we both kind of looked at each other and said almost in unison, but I don't feel like an author. It's just a weird feeling to have your name on the cover of a book, but there it is, so I guess we should get used to it. When I was growing up, I loved reading more than almost anything else. I liked to stay inside, and I would just read all summer long, as many books as I could possibly read. But I don't think I could have ever imagined that I would get to help write one, especially a cookbook. Around the age of 15, I remember going out on the front porch to find my mom, who was sitting on the porch swing with this huge stack of cookbooks. She loved to look through cookbooks for recipe inspiration. She was a really good cook, is a really good cook, and has always enjoyed doing it. But I was at that age where teenagers are when they're like, everything their parents do is really uncool, and you kind of, it always just irritates you. And so I think, you know, I was at this age where I was reading the classics like Hemingway and Faulkner, and if it didn't have some, you know, dead person's name on it, I wasn't interested. And so I kind of went out and rolled my eyes and sighed, and I was like, why are you always reading cookbooks? And I don't really remember what she said, but now that I have written a cookbook and the past 10 years of my life have been devoted to it, she never misses an opportunity to bring up that story. Which is fair. I owe her that. But you know, Irma's authorhood came kind of as a surprise to her as well. In fact, in the preface to the 1931 edition of Joy, she told a story about how when you're at a party, you always know who the author is because they waste no time in telling you. And her response was, "Oh, really? Well, I'm a reader." But then in the introduction, she said, "But now I am an author of sorts." Authorhood was not really in Irma's plan for her life. Would you put the first slide on? Oh, the next one.
This is my job.
Irma was from a upper middle class German family in St. Louis. She was born in 1887. My goodness. She married a young lawyer named Edgar, and they had 2 children. That's her and her sister, Elsa. And that's her daughter, Marion, and her husband, Edgar. And then she also had a son, Edgar Jr. Irma kept busy at home, but she was also a lively hostess and was really active in the St. Louis community. She was involved in things like the orchestra, helping bring artists to their community. She was also involved in the Unitarian Church in her neighborhood. There was an organization called the Women's Alliance, and she was a member of that, helping to provide cheap lunches for underprivileged children, building playgrounds in underserved neighborhoods. And she was of a generation, class, and upbringing where women were really not formally educated. She had been tutored privately as a child, and she learned things like poetry, music, art, drawing, really kind of skills that she would need to be a high-class wife and member of her community. She certainly didn't get any kind of professional training. It was kind of assumed that she would never have to hold down a job. However, life had other plans for Irma. Her husband Edgar had long suffered from undiagnosed mental illness. Throughout his whole adult life, he would occasionally come down with these bouts of severe depression where he couldn't work and couldn't do much of anything, and she took care of him. But one day, while Irma was out shopping, Edgar took his own life. And then Irma, at the age of 53, was suddenly in a position where she needed to make a living for herself. Luckily, one of her son was actually out of the house at that point. Her daughter was grown, but still living at home. And we don't really know why Irma chose cookbook author as her profession. It's not really pragmatic. This was during the Great Depression, and beyond that, Irma really was not known as a great cook. In fact, when she told her plans to friends and family, these are actual quotes from friends and family, they said, "Worst idea I've ever heard," and Irma's a terrible cook. But against all logic, Irma was one of those people who once she had an idea and she felt like it was a good one, there was no dissuading her from carrying it out. She was very strong-willed, very fiercely smart, even though she hadn't really been formally educated. So she started to compile recipes from her friends and family and in things that she had made all her life, and put it together to self-publish her little book, as she called it. Irma's daughter, Marion, helped her put it together and created these really charming paper-cut illustrations for all of the chapter headings, as well as the cover, and that's what you're seeing right now is the actual cover of the 1931 edition. And it is, as you can see, a woman with a handbag and a broom who's about to knock down a dragon.
I think the correct term is smite.
Yes, smite. She's about to smite a dragon. And so this is actually based on the Saint Martha of Bethany, who is the patron saint of cooks. And the dragon is this mythical French dragon called the Tarasque. So Saint Martha is getting ready as a home cook to slay the dragon of kitchen drudgery. Or that was Irma's take on it anyways. Let's see. This fantastical cover art kind of hints at what Irma was trying to do with that first edition. Most cookbooks of that era were pretty dry. They were usually written by home economics professionals, so people who made a career of knowing how to cook and knowing about nutrition. And these books were really informative, but they were not fun to read. You certainly wouldn't have paged through it and just read it for pleasure. Irma's book, on the other hand, was full of her personality and charm. She told personal anecdotes, historical asides, and she would occasionally make jokes. And so what she lacked in formal education, she more than made up for in wit. And she really put all of that into this first edition. So we think that Irma's inexperience in the kitchen is part of what made Joy of Cooking such a special book, and part of what endeared it to readers, and part of the reason why it's been around for almost 90 years now. She knew the struggles of her readers. She had a different perspective than the home economics experts. She was kind of in the trenches, having to put something on the table, maybe not knowing as much about food and cooking as she should have, but she knew what her readers were facing. So Irma wanted to give her readers something more than just an instruction manual. She wanted to give them something fun to read while they were cooking, while they were waiting for the water to boil or for the roast to finish cooking. I think she had this vision of her readers flipping through it and maybe finding a joke and laughing, or being charmed by the illustrations. And I think she knew that, like herself, she did not love to cook. She cooked because she needed to. I think she knew that a lot of her readers were in the same situation, that they needed to cook but maybe didn't love it, and so she wanted to give them something fun and charming to read while they were there.
Perhaps let them know that they're not alone.
Yeah. And also, you know, another interesting fact about the 1931 edition is that the very first recipe in the book is for a gin cocktail. This was during Prohibition, actually. So I think she opened it that way intentionally. Like, this is, you know, I think the headnote said, cocktails these days are made with gin and ingenuity. And it was kind of a formula for making bathtub gin taste good. Basically just gin and juice. It was like gin and grapefruit juice and bitters. But I think I think it's kind of a joke. I mean, I think it's real that she would actually drink that and expect her readers to drink it, but I think it was kind of a, like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of thing on her part.
Okay.
But only 3,000 copies of that first edition were printed, and Irma hand-sold them to friends and family and bookstores in the St. Louis area. But her book did well enough that she attracted the attention of a major Midwestern publisher, Bobbs Merrill. And Irma actually ended up signing a contract with them. In this case, her lack of formal education was kind of a liability. She went into a room with a man who had been in the publishing industry for a really long time and was a fierce negotiator. And from what we know, Irma left that meeting in tears and didn't feel well for weeks afterwards, because he had essentially talked her out of 50% of her copyright to the book. So she signed a contract to get it published because she thought that no one else would publish it, but unfortunately ended up losing something in the process. However, she gave him hell for the rest of her life. Do you want to turn?
So between the 1931 edition with the fanciful cover and the one that eventually came about from that horrible meeting, which was published in 1936, Irma actually decided to reinvent the recipe format. You know, she's in her mid-50s at this point and not a professional cook, but somehow she just thought she could improve on, you know, the basic format for writing recipes. And so this is actually taken from the new edition, but it's called the action method, and it's kind of a narrative format for recipes where the ingredients and the directives are mixed together. And it might be a little difficult for making grocery lists. I mean, they're in bold. It might be a little hard to see here. But what it is good for is when you're trying to multitask in the kitchen and, you know, you don't really want to lose your place at that moment. And going between the ingredient list and the directives can be very, I don't know, I guess, alienating, I think is the word.
Especially when you have a situation where the recipe it spans 2 pages. So you've got the ingredients at the top and you keep having to flip back and forth. And it says something like, add half the butter. And you're like, well, how much butter where's the butter? Okay, there's the butter, and then you've lost your place on the next page. Personally, that is one of my major pet peeves with recipes. So this format is more narrative, and it really allows you to cook. I mean, the recipe is written as you actually cook something. So it feels a little more natural when you're actually in the kitchen, kind of managing multiple tasks at once.
Well, and even in the case of this particular recipe, you can see that it requires for the beans to be soaked for a long time. Now, if it had been written in a normal format, you would think that you would have to prep all of this before you even start the recipe. But you're waiting for the beans to soften for overnight. So it kind of it makes sense in a lot of different ways.
So the night, go ahead and flip it.
My job.
So on the left, that's the 1936 edition. The cover is really amazing because it really gives you the hard sell. I love some of the text on there.
As modern as China clippers and television.
I don't really know what that means, but it's interesting. And so the 1936 edition was actually quite a bit larger than 31. You can't really tell from these photos, but the 1931 edition was about 300 pages?
Just shy of 400 pages, and maybe somewhere around 500, 600 recipes. The 1936 edition was, well, I think it even says up there, yeah, it claims to have 2,600 recipes in it, so she was busy in those 5 years. In addition to, creating a new format for writing recipes, she was doing a fair bit of cooking.
And actually, one more note about the action method format of writing recipes. It's still a pretty unique format, and almost no other cookbooks do it. I think we've only been able to find it in one other book, which was Alice Waters' The Art of Simple Food.
Yeah, Art of Simple Food 1 and 2.
And we're not sure why more folks haven't picked it up for recipe writing, because we think it's a really useful format. It takes a little getting used to, but I think once you do, you find that it's easier to use.
And this middle edition is the wartime edition. Irma was really a fan of newfangled foodstuffs as well as cooking techniques. So this edition, and because it was published during World War II, there's a lot of information about how to cope with ingredient rationing, so how to use less meat, how to get by with less butter, things of that nature. And of course, this was the first edition to really deal with pressure cooking, which I think this is Irma's direct quote, but it allows the cook to scoff at time, which I really like. And using canned goods, this is another thing that Irma was a big fan of. She was really a fan of anything that could get you out of the kitchen as quickly as possible.
And it's known as the wartime edition because it deals with it's really interesting actually if you have one of these 1943 editions to go through. In the back of the book there's this whole section on recipes that use less sugar or that use sugar substitutes, recipes that don't use meat or use alternate sources of protein, including soybeans. So I think it's really fascinating to look at that. It's like a little time capsule, and you can really see what home cooks were dealing with. And one of the things that Joy of Cooking has done really well for its entire career is kind of reflect the needs and questions that American home cooks are having in the kitchen, and trying to be there with them and letting them know that their questions are legitimate and that there are answers, and we're going to help you get there. So in the 1950s, which the one on the right is the 1951 edition. So Irma's health was kind of starting to decline at this point, and her daughter Marion stepped up to really help her out with revising the book. And more than revising the book, to help her deal with the publisher, because they had always had kind of a rocky relationship. But in the 50s, the publisher wanted to bring in color photography. And so they proposed a photographer who was the cousin of someone who worked at the publisher and had never actually done food photography before. So Irma and Marion were not happy about that decision, but the publisher didn't seem like they were going to budge. So Marion and Irma actually withheld the manuscript for months. They were supposed to be publishing the book. They were like, no, we're going to keep this, and you can change your mind, or we're just going to hold on to it. So they started playing chicken with the publisher, and at the time, Bob's Merrill, which was still the publisher of the book, was starting to, they were experiencing some financial difficulties, and Joy of Cooking had become kind of a household name. So the publisher actually really needed them to publish that book because it would help them break even.
Kind of an interesting trivia thing, the law firm that helped them deal with the publisher at this point that they had employed for this specific purpose of Plain Chicken is actually the same person who helped, I can't remember the publisher's name, but the James Joyce Ulysses obscenity trial and all of that, those are the same people. Kind of interesting.
I didn't know that. So yeah, the publisher ended up relenting, but as time went on, Marion especially, who was more of the artist of the family, she started to feel that photographs would never be appropriate in Joy of Cooking because she wanted it to be a timeless book. And she knew that if you add photographs, you're immediately going to date the book. And if you look at photographs of food from the 1950s and 1960s, it's head-scratching at best. Like, what were we really thinking? What even is this food?
It's like colors themselves have changed.
Yeah, it's amazing, the difference. And so, we have continued on with that. In the new edition, you might notice there are no photographs. And that was intentional because of Marion's reasoning, but also because it's such a large book that to include photographs would have been nearly impossible. It would have been just a scattering of them. It wouldn't really have been representative. And we felt like it didn't really fit with the overall mission of the book. We don't want people comparing their home cooking to a professionally cooked and styled photo of food. We want them to actually go and do their own thing and make it their own. So I think we can go.
Well, some other interesting facts about the 1951 edition. It is the largest number of stuffed tomato recipes that we've ever had was in 1951. Kind of shows you like a little culinary history there, like a little peek. And so here, this is actually Marion and her husband, John. They were both, you could actually legitimately call them modernists. John was an architect. He was one of the first architects in the Midwest to really be an adherent to the Bauhaus style of architecture. And Marion was actually she worked at the Cincinnati Art Museum. They moved to Cincinnati, I should have mentioned that, from St. Louis. And it was actually brought like a lot of modernist artists into town. But it really kind of informs even the cover of the 1951 edition. If you want to go back, you can kind of see, like, I think John designed that cover, and it kind of shows you, like, that there's a changing aesthetic going on here. But it also really came to dominate her editions of the book. She really conceived of Joy of Cooking as something like a little bit more grand in scale than Irma did. I mean, Irma certainly added many, many recipes, but it was, in essence, it was still just Irma's collection of recipes with Irma's witticisms and, just a really large collection of favorite recipes. Marion really wanted to reach beyond that and to try to make Joy of Cooking kind of the American version of the Larousse Gastronomique, kind of a total kitchen work, I think is something that people can turn to if they have whatever question, no matter how odd. So in the 1960s, do you want to switch? Oh, yeah. So this is their house. This is another, John, her husband, built this house in the style that he was doing. It's actually a lot of recipes in the 60s and 70s in those editions. They have cocaine as a descriptor, and it's a reference to their house. They really thought it was a great place. Cocaine is actually it's a mythical land of plenty. I think it dates from medieval French legends, where roasted fowl roam the streets, asking to be eaten, and the rivers run with wine. I mean, it's kind of like the Big Rock Candy Mountain of medieval France, I guess. So yeah, that's actually Marion at Cocaine, which is what they called their house. She was a really, really avid gardener. She actually published a whole book called Wild Wealth that was about gardening and stuff. So So yeah, you want to do the next slide? So in the 1960s, they came out with, I guess it would be the fifth edition. It was a completely different book. She really, I want to describe Joy sometimes as a palimpsest, which is, and back when when scribes had to reuse parchment, they would actually scrape away like what had been written previously and then write over it. And that's kind of, I think this is when Joy starts becoming a palimpsest in a way. Irma's personality is still there. I mean, they really tried to keep kind of the personability of Joy there, but she really was kind of really conceived of it as something like a much bigger work. And so a lot of recipes were added. She started talking about cooking techniques, like, just trying to explain them to the basics to, just for a general audience, people who may have never been in the kitchen before. She started adding, like, there was an entire chapter on ingredients and, both common and uncommon and how to use them.
And I feel like the Marian's editions are notable. As a lot of you might know, there is a famous squirrel illustration that's in the 1963. And it's of a squirrel, someone's skinning a squirrel, and they've got their foot on the squirrel's tail, and they're pulling the skin off. But it's a very famous illustration. We actually know someone who tattooed it on their leg.
It's like if it kind of, in the style of it, it's like if the Jetsons got dark.
Yeah, it does have that 60s vibe. But she added things like that. She added things, recipes for squirrel and possum. There's a recipe for whale in that edition.
Yeah, it's the last recipe in the fish chapter, and the head note to that recipe is last but vast. I like that. I don't know.
But Marian really, when John says that she envisioned it as a total work, she really thought, she wanted to include everything that she could possibly think of, any scenario that a cook might face. There's a recipe in there that we were looking at the other day for potatoes cooked in resin, and it's actually potatoes that are boiled in pine resin, and the recipe calls for 25 pounds of resin. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll just go pick up some resin at the store and make this recipe. But actually, it's like an old Southern recipe from when pine trees were being cut down en masse, and there was just apparently a lot of resin.
For the production of turpentine, and then the resin was a byproduct. Who knew?
But she really wanted to include everything she could possibly think of.
So yeah, these are her two editions, the 1963 and then the 1975. 1975 was the best-selling edition of Joy so far. not gonna say never.
Fingers crossed.
But yeah, no, these were really the editions that inspired us the most, and they're kind of like the high watermark that we aspire to, just in terms of like their just their tone, the kind of comprehensiveness. We really wanted to kind of double down on what Marian's project entailed. Yeah. And so here's Irma and Marian with my father, Ethan. Looking mischievous, which is kind of standard. It's kind of, anyways, yeah, so Ethan, that's here he is again. He's quite the hipster over here. And looking very serious with that, pointing at that tomato with his knife. I think trying to explain the anatomy of the tomato, I think. And it's my mother, Joan. But Ethan took over, Marian passed away in 1977. She had cancer. She had actually been struggling with cancer since the 1950s. So, all of the work that she did on Joy was kind of in the shadow of that illness, which I didn't learn that until pretty much quite a bit later. Just really, to me, it makes it even more courageous what she was able to accomplish. But so when she passed away, Ethan, who had actually trained, he was like the first member of the family and the only member of the family to be professionally trained at a culinary school. He went to the Cordon Bleu in 1960, I think it was 1969. And got a degree from there, and then went to work for the family. And here he is, and that's actually the old kitchen where Marion would test all of her recipes. Kind of a cool pegboard setup for the, I think Julia Child had a similar thing going on. And these are the two editions that he oversaw. So the 1997 edition, which there's a lot of, I guess, controversy over that one because it was kind of I like to call it a scorched earth rewrite. A whole bunch of chapters went missing because the manuscript just got so large. We actually have the galleys for it, and it's, really, really big.
2 volumes.
2 volumes. And
so they ended up having to cut things at the last minute to make room, so it would only be a 1-volume book. And in the process, they cut the preserving chapters, so all the jams and jellies and pickles and preserves.
Cocktails.
All the cocktails gone.
That's
cream,
important.
all the entire ice cream chapter was gone. So some serious casualties in that edition. On the other hand, it's the one that you took to college with you, so it was kind of your first joy.
Yeah, when I was flailing and had to fend for myself in a dorm room kitchen, I actually had a kitchen in my dorm room. That was the one that I managed to feed and not kill my dorm mates with. And this 2006 edition was kind of the family's attempt to reclaim the book and kind of take it back to the kind of comprehensive 1975 edition where, canning and cocktails all dealt with in the 2006. And so that's kind of brings it to where we come in, our edition. So, I was not groomed for this, for writing this book. My father, because I think he had been semi-forced into it, was very clear that, it's there for you if you want it, but you should follow your dreams, And so I did for a while, and what that really amounted to was getting a literature degree and working with a former professor for 5 years as a editorial assistant. And I was planning on going to graduate school. That was kind of the way things were shaping up, but I was kind of soured on it because I'm not a good public speaker and just thought I would be even worse at teaching. So was really not sure what to do, and I was actually visiting my father. Everybody was asleep. It was, I think, Christmas or Thanksgiving. It was cold, and I was just up too late, sipping a little bit of whiskey, and my dad has a collection of books in his basement, and a lot of them are like outdoorsy books. Of course, a lot of cookbooks, and there was one on the shelf that it just didn't really make much sense for him to have. It was like a collection of literary biographies. These are like things that I've been using for years now, toiling with, and it was like, this just doesn't seem like something he would want to read. So I went in there, and for the first time, there was an entry on Marion, and they quoted from her dedication to the 1963 edition, and reading that really kind of changed my life. But basically, the end of the dedication is, I hope that my sons and their wives continue to keep joy a family affair, beholden to no one but themselves and you, the reader. And that just really hit me. It just kind of brought everything into focus and changed my life. I've really just...
Well, that was the first time that anyone had ever told you that they wanted you to work on it.
That's true.
And you had having never met your grandmother, the first time maybe you felt like she was actually talking to you?
Thank you for upping the significance.
Yeah, no, I think it's cool.
I wasn't really selling that too well. But at any rate.
Not long after John decided he wanted to work for the family business, we had not met at that point, but we were living in the same town, Asheville, North Carolina, and we had both gone to school there. I was finishing up my senior year and working in a little bakery. And I had actually bought the joy of cooking for myself when I moved away from home to go to college. I realized when I was out on my own, my mother was such a great cook, and I had helped her do some things in the kitchen, but my cooking education was pretty sparse, and I realized that now I had to fend for myself, and I actually had to eat the things that I cooked, so I wanted them to be good. And for some reason, whatever reason, I don't know, I picked up a copy of Joy of Cooking, because my family didn't use Joy of Cooking when I was growing up. My mom was a Southern Living fan, and so she used all their cookbooks, and but I think I just knew that it was kind of the cooking Bible, and I could find pretty much anything I wanted to in that book. So I picked it up, had been using it for a few years, had some really fantastic first cooking experiences with that book. One I remember distinctly was, so I had worked on a farm for a few years as a cheesemaker's apprentice, and one day a fellow farmer was harvesting a bunch of their chickens and asked if I would come help. And so I did, and I think we slaughtered like 150 chickens that day, and it was really overwhelming, but at the end of the day, part of my payment was I got a chicken to take home. And I had never cooked a whole chicken before, and I really didn't want to mess it up. So I actually used Joy of Cooking to cook my first whole chicken, and it was a success and really delicious, and no one got sick. And so I just loved, that really gave me a huge appreciation for the book. I was a big fan, and so in 2010, I was working in this bakery, and I was kind of talking with a coworker of mine about how much I loved the book, and he said something like, well, didn't you know that the guy whose family wrote Joy of Cooking works at that coffee shop down the street? And I kind of thought he was messing with me, but I was going to find out. So after my shift, I went down to the coffee shop that I went to all the time to read or do homework or write papers or whatever. And I asked the barista if he knew anything about that, and it happened to be John who was working that day. And he turned really red and said, yes, that's my family. And I was so excited because I had no idea that there was actually still a family behind that book. I kind of thought that, it had been written a long time ago, and maybe it was just being done over and over by a publisher or by a group of people. Didn't know there was a family. To learn that there was actually still someone behind it was kind of amazing to me. So we started talking, we had a few more conversations, and eventually I was like, okay, I can tell he's not gonna ask me out. So I asked him out on a date, and he said yes, and...
Well, before that, I was like, oh, you were like, what do you do when you're not working? And I was like, well, I'm part of a book club, and...
I was like, no, that's not what I mean. So yeah, we started dating, and then, John had decided that he wanted to get into the family business, and so I think we started out by just writing for the Joy of Cooking website, and then your dad said, well, if you want to apprentice, you should come live on my property, and he lived in East Tennessee, and so we moved to East Tennessee to apprentice.
Which was, it was great, but it was also about an hour's drive away from the closest Kroger. So it was pretty much the worst place to start testing recipes. But that's pretty much what we did for 2 years. We're testing recipes out of the 2006 edition.
But I think it was really informative to have to test recipes in a place where there's not much food around. It kind of gave us some perspective into how some of our readers live, and like,
one thing, we were really close to Alan Benton, so we were good on bacon and country ham, so that was fine. But yeah, everything else was pretty inconvenient.
But we did that for a few years, and then we helped redo the website. We helped with we took over the social media accounts, and that was really cool because it actually gave us an opportunity to talk with readers. So when anyone had a question or a complaint, they would come to us, and we would be the ones to have to answer it and figure out what was wrong, or maybe they did something wrong or we did something wrong. So that was really informative. And then we helped to create an app for the book, so it contained the entire contents of the 2006 edition. It was a really great app. Didn't end up selling very well, but in the process of creating it, we had to kind of take the book apart and put it back together in a different form, and we were adding tags to everything and kind of organizing the material in a different way. And so we got this really intimate view into how the book is put together, and we found places where we felt we could make small improvements, or places where we knew we could make improvements. And also during the time we were recipe testing, we were doing, we're calling them recipe genealogies, but we would basically look at a recipe, test it, and then figure out where it had been added in the history of the book. So we would trace the recipe back as far as we could to figure out what edition it had been added in. And that gave us this big historical overview of the book and its recipes, and we could see how they changed over time and how, like, Marion would edit Irma's recipes, or Ethan might edit Marion's recipes, or just how things would change and evolve. And so after the app project was done, we finally felt like we were ready to start thinking about the next edition.
After 6 years of working on, stuff, we finally felt we were able to think about the new edition. It's just such a large project, but I mean, at that point we spent a good 6 months outlining it, and which basically entailed flipping through the book 3 times, page by page, section by section, and
deep reading of every section of every chapter. And at that point, we had tested about, how many recipes?
It was over 1,500 recipes at that point.
So we tested all these recipes, and then we made notes of, okay, these are the things we need to still test. These are new recipes that we want to add that we feel like are missing from the book. And so we just created this huge outline so we would have a clear blueprint of exactly what we wanted to do. Because we had kind of seen with the 1997 edition what happens when you maybe come into a project like that and you don't have a clear view of the history and you don't really know how the book is put together. So that's, in our opinion, is what made that edition feel kind of disjointed and impersonal, was that the people who were working on it didn't necessarily know that much about the book, or they hadn't really delved deeply into it.
Well, yeah, and those 2 previous editions, it actually, the publisher and my father had utilized a test kitchen, a professional test kitchen, and there was a lot of, we inherited like cabinets full of test notes, and we could tell like where there was like a communications breakdown, and it pretty much, I mean, we begrudgingly were like, I guess we're just gonna have to do all of this ourselves. And that's pretty much how we approached the whole thing. It was just the 2 of us and a handful of part-time contributors.
And it's, when people ask us what we changed in this new edition, it's really hard to sum it up. It's an 1,100-page book. So, we put our hands on everything. We made sure everything was right. We made sure the recipes worked. We added 600 new recipes, from classic American dishes like St. Louis gooey butter cake or Appalachian apple stack cake, to international dishes, everything from fromage fort, which is like a French cheese spread that's made out of leftover bits of cheese, to khao soi gai, which is a Thai soup with chicken and yellow curry paste. And we revised all the reference information to reflect the things that cooks can find in grocery stores and farmers markets now. That has even changed dramatically in the last 10 years.
Or even things like the science behind the caramelization of sugar. It was, part of that was actually very humbling because, the last edition, Harold McGee and Shirley Corrier, these very well-known food scientists / food writers, had helped us with that. So it felt very strange to be editing material that you knew came from some, really well-respected people. But I think that we did a pretty good job.
But also thinking about how our palates have changed over time. So how, Americans really value more flavorful food now, spicier food, fresher ingredients. And so, when looking back at the old vegetable chapter, for example, everything was coated in white sauce. Like, all the vegetables got this white sauce treatment, and it was just like, that's fine, that's an option, but that's not really how people cook anymore. So we tried to update things like that. Another example is the cakes chapter, which I actually feel like the cakes chapter is one of the strongest chapters in the book over time, because Irma actually did really enjoy baking cakes and decorating cakes. That was kind of her specialty. So the chapter stood up really well, but one of the things we noticed was that a lot of the recipes called for you to separate the eggs and then whip the whites and fold the whites into the batter at the end. And we had heard from a lot of readers that they really hated doing that and didn't want to, and so sometimes they wouldn't make the recipe because it seemed too onerous. And I started thinking, like, well, this recipe looks like it would work if you just added the eggs whole. So we started testing these recipes, adding the eggs whole, seeing what kind of difference it made versus separating them and whipping the whites. And it turned out that it wasn't that much of a difference, and have kind of come to the conclusion that back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, cooks kind of preferred these lighter, fluffier, taller cakes, and now people kind of prefer denser, more moist cakes. And so we made some changes like that. Regardless of all these changes, I feel like we tried to keep in mind the true spirit of what The Joy of Cooking is and what makes it so special to its readers. Like, why has this book endured for 90 years? That's a question we get all the time. And I think it does go back to Irma and her original wit and her, the way she actually talked to home cooks. And this project has ultimately been a 90-year conversation with American home cooks about what things they need, what questions they have, what's working, what's not working. And I think our readers they really respond to that. And we really care. Like, when we get an email and someone's having trouble with a recipe, we answer it every single time. When someone messages us on Facebook and is angry, we try to take it down a notch and be like, okay, let's think about this. Like, what's going on? We'll figure it out together. It's okay.
Or make jokes at their expense.
Yeah.
It really depends on how, it depends on the context, I guess.
But we also tried to keep the kind of the tone of this book as Irma had it. We try to tell stories. We tell historical asides about ingredients or about recipes. And we crack jokes every once in a while because we really want, for those of you who actually read the book, and we hope some of you do, we want you to laugh. Like, we want you to have fun. Cooking isn't just about obligation or about, we know it's not fun all the time, but it can be fun sometimes.
And with that, if anyone has any questions?
Yeah, we would love to answer questions.
The ushers have some microphones, and if you have a question, can you raise your hand and they'll bring you a microphone.
Oh, so I want to know whatever happened. I just want to know what happened with Bob's Merrill and the debacle of the holding out and playing chicken. Did you switch publishers? Did they renegotiate their contract? Are you happy now?
We're pretty happy now. Bob's Merrill actually, they went under. They were the last big Midwestern publisher. And so there was this really tumultuous time that fortunately my father, Ethan, had to deal with, and I did not have to. But I think at first the book, their half of the copyright went to ITT, which is a big conglomerate. I don't know why they were in the cookbook business. But then after that, it went to Macmillan. And actually, it's hard to see it when you're just pointing at covers. But there was about a 20-year gap in the publication of the 1975 edition in 1997. And that's pretty much, especially during the 80s, a lot of that was Ethan basically struggling to come to some sort of understanding with Macmillan, the publisher that he was having to deal with. He actually had an entire manuscript ready to go for a new Joy of Cooking in the 1980s that never saw the light of day because they were just totally intransigent. They really wanted to take the editorial control away from the family and kind of turn it into a hollowed out brand, pretty much. Eventually Ethan hired a new agent, and that's how we ended up with Simon & Schuster. We've had our ups and downs with them as well, but I think overall it's been really good.
I remember as a high school kid in the late 60s, fiddling around a bit with my mom's 1951 edition and enjoying some of the charming, but even then dated commentary. The mention of a cook, my family's cook, called hollandaise sauce, holiday sauce, that sort of thing, which I imagine probably comes from Mrs. Rombauer. But you commented on the genealogy of recipes. Curious about the genealogy of the commentary on the recipes.
Yeah, that's there is some of that. And I think one of the head notes that comes to mind for me, I think it was a recipe for Victorian seed cake, which was like a pound cake, but with, I think it had anise, maybe caraway seeds in it, so it was lightly flavored. And Irma, I think Irma wrote the head note that said, and I still don't fully understand this head note, so I'm saying it knowing that probably most of you won't understand it, and I don't either. But it was something like, this recipe calls to mind the days of antimacassars and aspidistra plants. And I was just like, I don't even know where to start with this head note. And there is, that's part of the charm, is that you get this window into the past and can sort of, if you bother to Google some of these things, you might find out what she's talking about. It's kind of like the dust jacket to the 1936 edition talking about clipper ships. Like, or China clippers. China clippers. But I think that is one of the cool things about the book, is that you can pick up an old copy and get a really good sense of what America was like, not just what were people eating, what were people talking about, what was kind of on the minds of Americans at the time. So yeah, there's definitely examples of that.
Just got to be careful, because obviously it's just, it was just Irma. She's hardly representative, but, an idiosyncratic window into another time, maybe.
Hi. I really appreciate the family history that you've shared with us today. And I really understand more about what you did with the book. I was glad to hear about all your technique differences, but I'm interested in hearing more about what you did with flavor. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. Well, so apparently the highest compliment, according to my father, Ethan, the highest compliment that Marion could ever bestow upon a dish is that it was delicately flavored. I have pretty much the opposite feeling. So I mean, as far as, flavor writ large goes, I feel like, it's hard not to feel like an armchair anthropologist when I say something like that, like a generalization like this, but I think that just in general, Americans are much more open to spicier foods. We are much more open to kind of more, challenging flavors, whether that's like miso, or even an ingredient like fish sauce, which you would never even hear about. Even in 2006, it was still pretty kind of rare to find at the grocery store. Korean ingredients like gochujang and doenjang.
But even basic flavors like, one of Marion's hallmarks in her recipes was she would tell the cook to, if it was a salad, it would be like, rub the bowl with a clove of garlic and then throw the garlic away. Or rub the pan with a clove of garlic and throw the garlic away. And to me, that's kind of unthinkable, and we usually add more garlic than most recipes call for. But I think in general, that feeling of things having to be, very subtly flavored, that's great in some cases, but I think the modern palate is a little more geared to just enhanced flavors and really more complex flavors, more diverse flavors. And so, we didn't necessarily change every recipe, but when we felt like it was warranted, we certainly added more garlic or ginger or whatever, the spice was. In some cases, old recipes would call for a few grains of cayenne pepper. And I was like, I don't even know how you measure that, so we're just gonna go with a 1/4 teaspoon. And so lots of little things like that, but also talking about ingredients and, when we added an ingredient that we thought maybe would be unfamiliar to some people or just a little less common, we would add a cross-reference to send people to the Know Your Ingredients chapter, which is an alphabetical listing of common ingredients, and it will tell you like how the ingredient is made, how it's commonly used, how can you use it, what it pairs well with. And so we're hoping not just to make the flavors of the recipes more interesting and inviting, but also teach cooks how they can use ingredients in other contexts.
I have a copy of a cookbook printed in 1896. Would you all ever consider reprinting the 1931 book just as it is?
Actually, the 1931 edition was reprinted in 1988, and it's still pretty widely
Still in
available.
print. It's the 1931 facsimile edition, so it is just as the 1931 edition was. I think the only difference is that Irma's son,
Irma's brother,
brother.
Edgar, son,
yeah.
son Edgar, Jr., also known as Putt, that was his family nickname. He wrote the introduction, a foreword to that, yeah.
But it is available.
Hi. With the amount of time it takes to get a book from the frying pan onto the bookseller's shelf, have you already started making plans for your 100-year celebration?
Yes.
We started making notes on what we were missing maybe a week after we turned in the manuscript. So yeah, it's a work in progress. I mean, it's a 90-year work in progress, and it's going to continue to go on as long as we can manage it. We're hoping to put out another edition for the 100th anniversary. That's kind of what we're aiming for. So we have until 2031 to get our ducks in a row.
Hello. I have the 1975 edition, which now opens to specific pages all by itself. But I've had to make some adjustments over the year. For example, if I have to add a can of something, let's say a can of beans, they're no longer 16 ounces. Have you changed that?
Yeah. We try to make, and specifically with can sizes, it's kind of frustrating because, I think that a standard coconut milk can is 13 and a half ounces, but it looks pretty much the same size as a can of beans, which is like 15 ounces. But yeah, we really tried to make sure that the ounces would match up.
It's hard to keep up with, food companies who want to cheat you by not telling you that the size has changed. I think my favorite one is ricotta it doesn't come in a pound container, it comes in a 15-ounce container. So we had to change the recipes to say, okay, 15 ounces of ricotta, which sounds weird, but that's how it comes. So yeah, we tried to change anything that didn't mesh with what was actually available to cooks.
Oh, and speaking of ounce measurements, which it kind of reminds me that we did add gram weights to the baking chapters, just because it makes a lot of sense from a kitchen mess perspective. If you can get away with not dirtying a bunch of cup measures, you're just going to be probably a little bit happier. And of course, it's more accurate too. So we give volume and weight measurements for most of the baking recipes, I think almost all of them.
Knowing the proliferation of America's Test Kitchen, Cooks Illustrated, that kind of thing, how do you see that affecting the process going forward, if at all?
Well, they do good work. We're never going to claim that one of our recipes is the best. And I think that's kind of where we part ways. Although I think that they're starting to get away from that language. But yeah, going forward, I don't know. One of the things that makes Joy different. I'm sorry, you had something to say.
I was just thinking that, we appreciate what they do, but what we do is kind of different, and that is, I don't know if it's easy to convey, but we try to give cooks a really holistic view of cooking, and we talk about this some in the introduction to the new edition and the section on getting started, which we recommend you read if you buy the book. But we talk a lot about food science in Joy. We have, the ingredients chapter. There's a chapter on techniques. If you don't know basic techniques, it's a great place to start. So we do deal a lot with cooking in a scientific way, but we feel like when you start to look at everything as a science project or like you're cooking in a lab, you sort of lose something that makes cooking great. And there's an art to cooking, there's a science to cooking, but you really need to combine all these elements to have your own cooking practice. And I think science can make you a better cook, but if it's not paired with realism and maybe some sense of artistry, but also kind of doing things on the fly and learning how to judge your ingredients, knowing when something's cooking a little too fast, you need to turn the heat down, because every stove is different. The ingredients you buy at the store are gonna vary all the time in quality and freshness and flavor. Sometimes apples are sweeter, sometimes they're more sour. It depends on the season, it depends on where they were grown. So we really want cooks to learn to kind of improvise and deal with the ever-changing nature of ingredients and their own kitchens and their own moods. Like sometimes you just go into the kitchen and things don't turn out right, and it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you or there's something wrong with the recipe. Like we all have bad days. But I think it's learning to look at cooking in that kind of holistic way rather than viewing every project as this thing that you have to like white knuckle your way through is really important to developing a cooking practice that's fun, that you actually enjoy.
And some slightly more subtle differences between us and outlets like America's Test Kitchen or Serious Eats is, you know, I think we have a much different formulation of what constitutes diminishing returns. So, you know, if we think that a particular task, well, you know, like let's say that you have a hack for, you know, the most perfect blueberry muffins ever, but it's going to add like a good 6 hours of waiting around for something, or I don't know. I mean, this is a horrible example, but you know, I guess my point is like, yeah, you know, it is going to turn out a little bit better, but you know, is it, you know, quote unquote worth it? You know, either like the kind of attention you have to pay or the amount of time you have to invest into making it better.
Yeah, what's the return on investment that you're getting from this extra step, or, you know, and that was something we also paid attention to when we were revising recipes was, okay, we test this recipe and it dirties 6 different bowls and all these utensils, and we're just like, this is crazy, my sink is full of dishes, this makes no sense, I don't want to do this, I don't want to make this recipe. Is there any way we can simplify without losing the essence of what this is? Is there a way we can make it just a little easier to follow, a little more intuitive, that will leave cooks with fewer dishes to do at the end? Because sometimes that's really important.
And also our business model isn't by the click or by the issue. You know, we don't necessarily have a vested interest in novelty for its own sake. So I think that, you know, it's just different. Enthusiasts, including myself, have gotten a lot out of Cooks Illustrated and Serious Eats and America's Test Kitchen on all of those different outlets, but I think we just provide a different service. We're trying to be there for beginners, for experienced cooks. You know, we're just trying to cast as wide a net as possible, not necessarily just the hobbyist who has maybe a little bit more time on their hands.
Given the fact that The Joy of Cooking is a brilliant name for a cookbook, but what you've told us about Irma and her background, do you think she was being ironic?
Yes, yes. I mean, I've definitely had the exact thought. I'm not exactly sure how much irony is in that title, but for sure, yeah.
Yeah, she wasn't, I mean, Irma was, while she wasn't formally educated, she was very whip smart, and I think there was a hint of sarcasm.
Yeah. But I don't know. I think that, you know, you can definitely find, that being said, I'm sure that she enjoyed her time in the kitchen at least some. You know, like.
Can we give a big round of applause, please, for John and Megan? Terrific job. Great job. Just wait one second. Here's something that you may be able to enhance your joy of cooking with, Leopold's ice cream book. All right, folks, that ends our 4-day extravaganza. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Please look to the website for future announcements for next year. And thank you for coming, and thank you to the sponsors.